This episode of Up From Dust starts with a not at all scary scene, I promise, that just happens to have some spiders in it. And it got me thinking about our aversions. Several people have told me since we started this show, like, hey, I like wildlife, but there's this one thing that stops me from doing a wildlife-friendly garden at home. And maybe for them, it's spiders, or it's wasps, or it's snakes. And it could be because of a phobia, a bad experience, maybe a serious allergy. So I'm curious to hear from you. Is there a critter that seriously stresses you out in the garden, on the hiking trail, wherever outdoors? And does it hold you back from enjoying the outdoors, or do you get out there anyway? Has the anxiety gotten better over time? Do you have any tips for that? You can leave us your stories at 816-235-8022. Maybe we'll do an episode. Thanks. Okay, let's start the show. Okay, so what does it feel like for you when you are on the ground looking for things? I imagine it almost being a little zen.
Oh, very much. Usually, I find something that I've either never seen before or something that I've not photographed before.
Okay, guys, this is Chris Helzer. He has spent an inordinate amount of time photographing a single square meter of prairie, just patiently, thoroughly scanning it for critters going about their day. This little spot is in Nebraska, and Chris is an ecologist.
I've been studying prairies for more than 30 years now.
30 years. So that's his day job. But for the purposes of this story, you also need to know that Chris is a super talented photographer. And for 2 years, he visited this one patch of prairie over and over. The payoff? A tiny world opened up to him.
There was a cobweb spider that had made a little tent under a leaf by folding the leaf together and holding it together with silk.
Chris is lying on his belly, camera in front of him, watching her in her cozy tent.
And she was sitting underneath there, and she had just molted.
She's all pretty in her new duds, so to speak.
And then I see this skinny little spider that looks kind of like her crawl up. And then I got to, over the next 10 or 15 minutes, I got to watch the two spiders mate with each other. And then I got to see the male spider scurry away very quickly after mating was over to save his life, so he wasn't just food. And then he sat like 3 inches away and guarded that female until I eventually left because he wanted to make sure no other males came to mate with her.
And then this other time, Chris spotted a different spider.
A lynx spider.
Very small critter, free-moving, no web. And Chris realizes she's sitting on a package of silk.
And I watched this lynx spider female sit on that egg sac day after day after day for a couple of weeks.
A watchful eye, 8 eyes actually, guarding the next generation.
And then eventually all the eggs hatched. Then I was surrounded by these tiny, tiny, tiny little pinprick-sized spiderlings hanging from threads of silk from flowers and stems and crawling around and blowing through the air, and I got to photograph those.
What are you feeling in that moment when these tiny baby spiders are dangling from silk?
Yeah, it's incredible. In some ways it is meditative, but it's also really invigorating and exciting. You feel like you've been allowed into this private space to see something that people don't normally get to see. Bees come and go from flowers. Spittlebugs, which are these little larvae that feed on the stem of a plant, and they have these little bubbles that come out their rear end that form these like masses of slimy bubbles that they live in, which protects them from predators. And I got to watch them, wiggling their little butts.
Okay, I know I'm a nerd, but come on, this sounds like fun, right? It sounds like fun. But let's go back for a sec to Chris's regular gig.
I'm the Director of Science and Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska.
So he oversees the management of some pretty big and ecologically important prairies, like at the 56,000-acre Niobrara Valley Preserve. It's one of the Nature Conservancy's biggest preserves in the United States. So when I first saw Chris's gorgeous photos of the square meter where he's spent so much time, obviously I assumed that's what I was looking at. But, plot twist, this is not pristine, remote, Nature Conservancy land that I have to drive 3 hours to get to from the nearest town. And I think you described this like little prairie plot as like behind the animal shelter.
Right.
It's actually in a field just right at the edge of town. A little prairie restoration that's less than 10 acres, planted in the 1980s with a trail running through for folks to walk and bike.
I wanted to do something that felt accessible to other people. I didn't want to go someplace where people couldn't go and do something similar.
I mean, this is the kind of place you may well have near you in your town or city.
Right? Anybody can pick a small area and look at it and watch what happens.
It is all about the power of observation, not just hiking and biking through, but stopping and wondering what we're passing by. Chris's little patch, it never disappoints. At this point, he has seen hundreds of species there. He's done a lot of amazing macro photography, super detailed images of the flowers, the fungi, the animals, up close and personal while their lives unfold. From the Kansas News Service and KCUR studios, you're listening to Up From Dust. I'm Celia Yopis Jepsen. Prairies used to cover nearly a third of our continent. They're mostly gone, and what's left is still shrinking. If we want to protect what's left, it's going to take a lot of work. And that includes convincing people that prairies are worth keeping. And so enter Chris. Chris Helzer is like a camera-toting scientist on a PR offensive. He is putting his art as a photographer and a writer to work and hoping to win the rest of us over.
I can show people why even tiny little pieces of prairie are important. I can show them why they're fascinating.
That's what his Square Meter project is for, to show us. But it ended up hooking him too in ways he didn't expect. It may always be the same spot on a map, a little dot just at the edge of Aurora, Nebraska. But really, though, it is never the same place twice. Okay, so funny thing, Chris Helzer has not always loved prairies. A bit about his childhood. I think a lot of Great Plains listeners are going to relate. Chris was a little kid in the Nebraska Panhandle, so it's a very rural area.
I was really lucky that I spent a lot of time outdoors.
His dad was a scientist.
He, on weekends, would take me fishing or camping, and my mom would tag along and watch birds.
And when Chris hit his teen years, he learned to drive, which was just a reason to spend yet more time outdoors.
That's where I would drive. I would drive out and go fishing on weekends by myself. That's how I got through college with my sanity intact. But about my second year in college, I had a friend that came up to me and asked me if I ever thought about prairies. And I said, not really. And he pointed out that that was a weird thing because we were both in a state where grasslands were the dominant ecosystem.
But not just that. Both of these guys were specifically into conservation issues. If you weren't thinking of prairies, what were you into?
It's pretty embarrassing, actually.
Confess.
Yeah, no, I will. It's embarrassing, but it's good for me to remember that it's not unusual to grow up the way that I grew up. We would drive through miles and miles and miles of prairie to get to a lake to go fishing and some trees to camp under. And so my vision of nature and conservation was trees and lakes.
High schooler Chris had been picturing becoming a forest ranger someday.
I was a Boy Scout, and for my Eagle project, I planted 500 trees.
But that day in the 90s, when his college friend was basically like, "Prairies, Chris, what about the prairies?" I mean, that kind of snapped him out of it.
My weekend plans switched pretty quickly from fishing to photography and prairies, and I've just never really looked back from that. Once I started thinking about prairies, I saw them everywhere and realized that there were probably a lot of other people that weren't seeing them just like I hadn't, and I've dedicated a lot of my life to changing that.
And the way Chris sees it, if you're trying to pique people's curiosity about grasslands, don't lead with the heavy stuff.
And I would much rather talk about why they're interesting than why they're important. But if you're going to hook somebody on prairies, for example, I don't think it makes sense to start out by saying, "Hi, I'm Chris. Let me tell you about prairies and why they're important for carbon sequestration and filtering water." Like everybody's going to go to sleep. I would much rather say, "Let me tell you about prairies because prairies are where oil beetles live. And let me tell you this amazing story about this little oil beetle that you might not have ever heard of before." And then they're hooked. And eventually you can say, "Oh, and by the way, prairies also help us have clean water. Isn't that great?"
Okay, I hear you thinking out there, what is an oil beetle? That's what Chris wondered too the first time he saw one, so let's get into it. His first sighting, one of these beetles was tromping around on a delicate white flower that opens super early in spring, a pasque flower. And this beetle jumped out at him because it was cute, but also like a bit odd.
I saw this big black bulbous looking beetle.
Like with way too small wings and a great round abdomen.
There's no way that thing can fly, right?
So he read up on it.
Okay, what can I learn about this? Because every time I take a picture of something new, there's a story of some kind.
And the oil beetle story is about some next level hitchhiking. When they hatch,
they all gather together and make a pile of little larvae.
They don't look like beetles at this point. They're little larvae teaming up so that they can collectively produce a smell.
Like a pheromone, right?
And specifically, it smells like a female bee that wants to mate.
What happens, of course, is a male bee catches that pheromone floating through the air, follows it like an old Looney Tunes cartoon to a pie.
And it eagerly lands on that pile of cunning larvae.
The male bee's going to be fine. Don't worry about the bee.
But he is like, what? There's no female bee here.
So the male bee flies away with all these little hitchhikers
who get a free airborne tour of the prairie while he keeps searching. And when he finally finds a mate, that's the cue. The larvae hitch their second ride.
All those little larvae crawl down onto the female bee, who's also going to be okay. Nothing's going to happen to the female bee. She flies back to her nest,
where the beetle babies disembark, eat all the food she's been stockpiling for her eggs, and, well, they do also eat her eggs.
So it doesn't end up well for the bees' babies, but it's an amazing story. It's an amazing creature. It's an amazing set of adaptations and strategies.
Important footnote from Chris. Oil beetles are not why bees are struggling today. They are part of a healthy prairie food web. Do not go around hating on oil beetles. This is the kind of story Chris likes to share. Through his photography and his writing, which, by the way, you can find on his blog, The Prairie Ecologist. He's got thousands of subscribers and 2.8 million views.
And you start to feel like a preacher. You're telling people the same thing, but you're trying to find new ways to say it.
I mean, yeah, he's been publishing on this site for years. So he's constantly brainstorming. How do I showcase what's left of these landscapes that we've mostly plowed and paved and now largely ignore? And this guy, who wanders all sorts of grand prairies, capturing stunning photos of sweeping vistas, it pops into his head, hang on, I should just pick 1 square meter and stare at it.
Boy, when you describe it that way, it sounds weird.
Not weird. I totally see his point.
You know, if I'm trying to show people that prairies are really complex and there's a lot that happens even within a small piece of a prairie, why don't I just do that? Why don't I show them what's happening in a small piece of prairie? Immediately went out to this little prairie here in Aurora, Nebraska, where I live. Took 4 flags and stuck them in the ground and then thought, well, we'll see what happens, right? Maybe I'll try it for a while. And at that point, I was envisioning something where I would go out a handful of times through the year.
A handful of visits. This would be interesting, but not a big commitment. Just some seasonal photos taken over the course of a year. But guys, that is not what ended up happening.
And that turned into an obsession that I didn't see coming.
But come on, who isn't happier with a bit of obsession in their lives, right? So, more on what has got to be the world's most photographed patch of prairie in a moment. So, scientists say tall grass is one of the most diverse ecosystems you'll find. It is thrumming with life.
There's a lot of species condensed into one small space. If you just think about bees, There's probably 400 or 500 species of bees in Kansas, and the vast majority of those are going to be found in a tallgrass prairie.
That's just the stuff you can see.
I think there's 10 times the biomass of insects underground than there are above ground.
And sure, Chris's plot is in a tallgrass prairie restoration. So, I'm imagining maybe it's not as diverse as some super remote patch of tallgrass in an area where there's no cropland and housing developments nearby, where there's never been any plowing, etc. But by doing all this lovely photography in a patch of grass that's right by a trail where folks stroll every day, he's shown us that these restored spaces are oases of diversity too, and that a shocking number of species can be right under our noses. So to recap, in January 2018, Chris starts his square meter project seeking a fresh angle on wooing the public to fall in love with grasslands the way he did. And at the same time, he figures maybe he doesn't even need to visit the specific plot all that often to do it, which is good because initially he's kind of got mixed feelings about that.
Because normally when I take pictures, I'm hunting for photo opportunities, right? I'm following the light. I'm looking for something that's happening. And so I'm on the move quite a bit. And I was just worried that being glued to one spot was going to be frustrating. I would always be thinking about what I was missing out on someplace else.
Hey, I get it, because I really enjoy his photos that show all the action and variety out there on the plains. Dramatic lightning strikes over the Niobrara Valley and bison trotting over a hill at dawn. But once Chris trained his attention and his camera on this little plot, his FOMO vanished.
And the opposite happened.
He calls it one of the best things he's ever done.
When I wasn't at my plot, all I could think about was what I was missing because something was happening at my square meter plot and I wasn't there to see it.
He ended up publishing a book, a collection of what he saw called Hidden Prairie, Photographing Life in 1 Square Meter. I told you before, Chris photographed this plot for 2 years, actually. Well, his book came out after the first year, and then he was done. Time to knock out other projects, life moved on, right? But this little plot kind of just stuck with him. And he tried to find the markers he'd put out in that field around the square meter originally, but at first he couldn't find them again. And then finally he did. And so in 2024, he started taking some photos again. Morning dewdrops, a robin hunting for its breakfast. And I guess muscle memory just kind of took over. He realized he wanted to do the whole thing again. This place has a hold on you.
It really, really does. Yeah, and it's not a bad hold. It's great.
So Chris recently finished his second whole year photographing the same spot. He squeezed in 131 visits this time, got thousands of photos. I caught up with him just as he finished year 2.
I'm at 321 species that I have photographed. And to be clear, I've seen more species than that. I'm only counting the ones that I actually got a good, sharp photo of.
If you're a photographer, nice thing about a prairie is you've really got a whole rainbow of colors to work with, right?
Butterfly milkweed, Maximilian sunflower, lead plant.
That's orange, yellow, and purple right there. Plus, there's always something on the move. A frog, a wasp, a praying mantis.
The most diverse insects in my square meter plot were flies.
There are flies with wings like stained glass windows, flies that look like they're wearing gas masks. He's found more than 50 kinds.
There's probably more, but I can't find anybody who can identify them or tell me whether these two are the same or not, because there's so many species. Nobody can be an expert in all of them.
There are many thousands of fly species in North America.
Oh, there was a fly that was dead because it had been killed by a fungus.
This is cool. So a spore had landed on it.
And it's exactly out of the horror movie genre, right? So
it grew into the fly's brain and hijacked it.
Made it crawl up high onto a little stem of grass.
Even made this little zombie fly die with its wings spread out so that it looks like it's waiting for a mate.
It was covered with spores, and so other flies come to land on it to mate with it, and then go away with the spores that are going to kill them in the exact same way.
Oh, you want to talk about STDs? There you go.
Yeah.
Man, all these animals out there just trying to mate and facing all these dangers. Like spiders scurrying away from their mates, like, don't eat me.
Right.
And
Yeah.
these poor male bees that are carrying these crazy larvae.
You have to reproduce somehow.
I know, you gotta take the risk. Did you ever get frustrated wondering what happens in that plot at night? All the shenanigans those insects must be getting up to when you're not looking?
Absolutely. And below ground, right?
Okay, so in the show notes of this podcast episode, we will link to Chris's blog where you can find his photography and his writing. So, grab a cup of tea later when you need to slow down your day and enjoy a peaceful scroll through them. And seriously, view these images full screen if you can, like on a decent sized screen, so you can see the details, because it's totally worth it. Some of my favorite photos are these hyper close-ups that you have. We've all seen monarch butterflies, but when you see them that detailed and close, it just looks so different. It's like this giant plush toy filling the frame.
And there's a lot more black and white patterning than you might expect, and the eyes have a texture to them. A lot of my photography of insects, I try to show the face, and I often take it from the face forwards, like they're looking at the camera, because I think that makes insects especially more relatable, because that's how we relate to each other, right? We look at each other's faces and we identify each other that way.
You describe praying mantises as the most photogenic insect. You would swear they have pupils.
Yes, and they don't. They have compound eyes, but yeah, there's this amazing sort of trick of the light, refraction of light, that as they move or as you move, this little black dot follows you around within their eye. If you get a chance to see one like that, get as close as you can and then move around and you'll see the same thing. It's a great illusion.
Oh, you have a photo that I love of Maximilian flowers. You took it from below the flowers. The flowers are full of holes. You can see the sky through them. It's almost like you're looking up at lace. I feel like I would walk out and try to get a photo of the prettiest flower I can find. I look at your photo and I realize, oh, these flowers are food.
I think a lot of people, if they see an insect has chewed a hole in their leaf, or even worse, God forbid, that's chewed a hole in the petal of a flower, they say, oh, that insect is hurting my flowers. Instead of, like you just said, thinking, oh, wow, look at that. I'm providing food for this species. Now I get a chance to watch this interaction happen right in front of me. So it's funny because we feed birds and we think success is having a bird that comes to the bird feeder. And then we put out all these plants that insects love and we don't see success the same way. The more insects that are eating your flowers, the more successful you've been at doing something really cool for conservation and giving yourself the chance to see what's happening.
So, what do you think? Does Chris talking about why prairies are interesting, fun, exciting places make you also think about why they're worth preserving? Because remember, that's why he's doing all of this in the first place, really. Prairies kind of have the cards stacked against them.
I think that the biggest threat to prairies right now is still the same as it's always been, which is habitat loss and fragmentation.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the future of grasslands.
We've converted a lot of our prairies to something else. Row crops, cities, livestock confinement.
Big swaths of prairie become scattered, smaller pieces cut off from each other by these other land uses, and therefore more vulnerable to invasive species and a host of other problems.
Because small, isolated prairies are really hard to conserve. The bigger a prairie is, the more connected it is to other sites, the easier it is to keep all the species around. But we have a solution to that, which is restoration, right? We know how to replant prairies, and while it doesn't recreate what was lost exactly, we can pick strategically places where we have a couple of prairies that are relatively close to each other.
And then replant between those spaces, creating like a kind of connective tissue.
Now species can move across back and forth between those prairies. You have larger populations, which are easier to keep around. So there's a lot of hope there for me. We know how to do that. The reason we're not doing more of it is that society has not prioritized it.
Context. North America is still losing millions of acres of grassland annually, and a good chunk of that loss is getting rid of prairie to make room for more corn, more soybeans, etc.
It's a lot easier to make money off of a cornfield right now than it is off of a prairie. Even if you're grazing that prairie, you're making much less money than you can make if that's in corn or soybeans right now.
Grazing cattle.
Yeah, grazing cattle. But again, that's a choice that we are making as a society. We can change our minds on that if we want to and say we want to prioritize things. And if we decide that, like we as conservationists, we know how to make that happen. We can restore prairies.
So, conservation groups see supporting the financial viability of ranching, plus helping ranchers ranch sustainably, of course, as critical to protecting prairies and their wildlife. Because it's a form of income that can keep rangeland from becoming sliced up and turning into cornfields and subdivisions and feedlots.
Yeah, I mean, if you own land, you have to pay taxes on the land. In most cases, you also have to make a living. So ranching is right now the best, most compatible way that I know of that somebody can make a living on a grassland.
Plus, scientists like Chris know that big animals grazing, that's actually a key piece of how grassland ecology works. So he actually sees a route to progress by supporting ranchers. And there's this other thing that keeps him hopeful, and it may sound a little bit like a contradiction, but bear with me. Prairies are threatened. I mean, really threatened. But they are also tough as nails.
If you look back at the Dust Bowl years in the 1930s, one of the famous prairie ecologists, John Weaver, who's at the University of Nebraska, he was watching and documenting how all of his favorite prairies that he knew very well were, like, in his eyes at the time, being destroyed by this drought. So there were plant species that just disappeared. You couldn't find them anymore. And western wheatgrass, for example, like, would take over an entire prairie. He's like, what is happening? I've never seen this. It's probably never going to recover again. And then the 1940s came and everything fixed itself. And he documented these incredible profusions of wildflowers in the early 1940s when the rain came. Nothing like you'd ever seen before, right?
How did it rebound? Well, part of the secret is the sheer number of species packed tightly together. When conditions change, different ones can take center stage. Others can melt into the background. I like to picture the prairie almost like shape-shifting. And so it keeps chugging along, even in extremes.
Prairies have shown themselves to be resilient enough to handle a lot of really dramatic things.
And that means they can continue to handle a lot if we step up and decide to keep them in our world. And that part's on us. If
we fulfill our obligation as managers and we help sort of facilitate the resilience that's already inherent in prairies, I'm actually pretty optimistic. It really is up to us to make decisions about where we want prairies and how we want them to look, more than this sort of catastrophe where everything's falling apart and there's nothing we can do about it. We really do have a lot of power and a lot of ways to influence what happens next.
Up From Dust is a production of KCUR Studios and the Kansas News Service. We are public radio. Please support public radio. Okay, Chris gave me some Nebraska hiking tips. I will link to some of those in the show notes. Another point of interest, the World Wildlife Fund actually calculates how much prairie gets plowed each year and turned into cropland. In 2022, their most recent year, nearly 2 million acres of Great Plains grasslands became crops. This episode was reported, written, and mixed by me, Celia Yopis-Jepsen. My editors are Mackenzie Martin and Stephen Caranda. Big thanks to Suzanne Hogan, Gabe Rosenberg, and Geneviève Demarteau. Jessica Cornelissen is the artist behind our podcast logo. Music provided by David Condos, Tom Lonnie, Milktooth, and Blue Dot Sessions. Sound effects from Pixabay. So, next time on Up From Dust, we are continuing with this prairie theme, and we are heading to Iowa to meet a farmer who boarded an airplane, and by the time he landed, had a very different view of his role in the world. Till then, thanks for listening.